You're working, you're saving, and your rent just went up again. When you look for answers, everyone points somewhere else, at interest rates, at the market. I am Felix, and what Felix is about to show you is that none of those are the real explanation. The real reason is buried in a 1926 Supreme Court ruling. That court used one specific word to describe your apartment building. That word was parasite. Once you understand what they meant, your financial life starts to make a very different kind of sense. Here's what most people experience. Housing is swallowing everything. More than 30% of your income is gone before you've bought a single thing. You've thought about moving somewhere cheaper, but the jobs there don't justify it. So you stay. The rent goes up and it feels like the game is rigged. And here's what Felix wants to say plainly. It is. Not through some conspiracy, through a legal system built deliberately to keep affordable housing scarce. That system has been running for 100 years, and almost nobody talks about where it actually started. Before Hoover was president, he was Secretary of Commerce. In 1922, he published something called the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. It was a ready-made law giving every city in America the power to divide land into zones. Residential here, commercial there, industrial somewhere else. On paper, that sounds reasonable. Keep factory smoke away from schools. But the residential zones didn't just separate homes from factories. They separated types of homes from each other. The single-family house was protected. Apartments, houses, pushed to the margins or banned entirely. Cities copied the template almost immediately, but it wasn't the best of ideas. Here's what American cities looked like before that law arrived. Walk a block in Chicago or Baltimore in 1910, and you'd find a grocery above an apartment, next to a row house, next to a workshop. Dense, messy, and affordable. Workers lived near where they worked. People at different income levels shared the same street. The jumble worked. Hoover and the reformers around him found it threatening. In public, they used the language of health and safety. But the historical record is clear about what they were actually trying to separate. And to understand that, you need to look at who was living in those tenements they wanted to zone away. The immigrants arriving in American cities at the time were living in tenements. In private letters and city council chambers, the architects of zoning reform were candid. They wanted to protect wealthier, established neighborhoods from those buildings. Zoning wasn't purely about land use. It was a tool for separating people by class and background, dressed up in the language of urban planning. That's the uncomfortable foundation this entire system is built on. But to make it permanent, constitutionally permanent, they needed a court. And in 1926, the Supreme Court delivered exactly what they needed. The case is called Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company. A suburb of Cleveland had banned apartment buildings from its residential zones. A developer sued, arguing that a city had no right to tell a landowner they couldn't build family housing on their own land. The Supreme Court ruled against the developer. The majority held that separating housing types was a legitimate use of government power. But it wasn't the ruling itself that mattered most. It was the specific word the justices chose to describe apartment buildings, because that word became the legal and cultural foundation for everything that followed. The Supreme Court's majority opinion described apartment buildings as parasites, structures that steal the open air and sunlight belonging to the single-family home. A parasite. That word entered the legal record, and from that point every American. City had constitutional cover to ban apartments from most of their residential land. Not temporarily, permanently. Zoning historians call the system that followed Euclidean zoning after that Ohio suburb. Within a generation it was everywhere. Today, in cities like Los Angeles, Seattle, and Chicago, between 75 and 80% of all residential land is zoned exclusively for detached single-family homes. On most of it, building a duplex is a crime. Sit with that for a moment. On the vast majority of land in American cities where people are legally permitted to live, it is against the law to build a small apartment, a modest two-flat, even if you own the land, even if the rental market is desperate for it. The law, written in the language of a 1926 court that called your building a parasite, says no. And that no is not abstract. It has a number attached to it, a very large one, and it affects you personally. In 2019, economists Changtai Xie and Enrico Moretti asked, what if just 3 cities, New York, San Francisco, and San Jose, relaxed their zoning back to 1964 levels? Their finding was staggering. US GDP is roughly 36% lower than it would otherwise be. $7 to $9 trillion in lost economic output, not lost to a war or recession, lost because people can't afford to move to where the best jobs are, because the housing near those jobs simply does not exist at any price a working person can afford. And the people absorbing that loss aren't statistics, they're people exactly like the one watching this right now. Here's a way to feel the magnitude. America's highest paying jobs are concentrated in a handful of cities: tech in San Francisco, finance in New York, media in Los Angeles. those cities also happen to have some of the most restrictive zoning in the country. So the wage premium that exists in those places, the extra money you'd earn simply by being there, is, for most, inaccessible. Because they can't afford the rent. The economic ladder still exists, but someone removed the bottom rungs, and the law is what took them. Zoning codes don't just regulate buildings. In many American towns and cities, they regulate who is legally allowed to live together. Many local ordinances include occupancy limits, rules that define what counts as a family. In a startling number of jurisdictions, that definition prevents more than 2 or 3 unrelated people from sharing a home. This wasn't accidental, it was designed to eliminate boarding houses, the American shared living arrangement for decades. By legally defining family as people connected by blood or marriage, the law quietly killed that entire safety net. Think about what that definition means today. If you're in your 30s and trying to split a 4-bedroom apartment with friends to make rent work, in many American cities, that arrangement technically violates the zoning code, not because of noise, not because of parking, because of a definition of family, written a century ago and never revisited, and underneath that sits one more mechanism, the one that acts as an invisible price floor under every piece of residential land in America, the one that makes it mathematically impossible to build affordable housing, even if a developer genuinely wanted to. This is the piece most people never hear. This is the part that bothers Felix most. None of this is hidden. Housing economists have documented it. Urban historians have written about it. Local journalists have covered individual zoning fights for decades, and still, the system runs almost unchanged after 100 years. Because most people engaging with the housing crisis are looking at prices, not at the laws underneath prices. They're arguing about symptoms, rents, mortgage rates, developer profits, while the legal architecture that generates those symptoms sits untouched. Knowing where the problem actually lives is not a small thing. It is precisely the thing that has been missing from this conversation for a very long time. Now for the part that matters. Felix doesn't think you should walk away from this feeling powerless. This system was built through local political choices, and local choices can be reversed. Your city council controls zoning. These aren't federal debates argued on cable news. They are votes taken in city hall meetings with 30 people in the room, mostly homeowners. The rooms aren't full because most people who should be in them don't know this history. Now you do. The housing crisis was fueled by a 1926 Supreme Court ruling that called your building a parasite. You now know where it came from, what it's costing you every month, and you know exactly where the decision is being made. They spent a century calling your home a parasite. Felix thinks it's time you showed them who really owns the neighborhood. Subscribe before the next one drops.